Well, the Robert E. Lee statue is no more, melted down in secret in this symbolic ceremony to be remade into an inclusive piece of public art. Story for you at Fox News. And I find this to be a real scream because haven't we been told that if you take down the statues of Lee, take down the Confederate battle flag, any racist symbol, any racist, sexist, or homophobic symbol, that's going to get rid of racism, sexism, homophobia? Correct me if I'm wrong here, but don't we have a war going on in Israel? Didn't we have these insurrections last week, part of this Jews for Peace and If Not Now group that had this sit down in the Cannon office building in D.C., 300 people or so? There was a lot more people there than that. But they were chanting, Israel to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's not a form of racism? So this is a story by Alexander Hall. Lee's statue's proposed removal sparked Unite the Right rally in 2017. As though Robert E. Lee himself was responsible for this Unite the Right rally in 2017. How many of you know when this statue was actually built? It was built back in 1884. And I'll get to that here in a moment. Because between 1865 to 1915, and there's an article about this at the Met, themet.com, between 1865 and 1915, you had this quote-unquote statue race. But I'll talk about that here in a second. So the article starts out, the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, that once stood in Charlottesville, Virginia, was secretly melted down at a ceremonial event. So this is a ceremony to these people. After both cultural and legal battles, the statue of Lee that sparked the infamous Charlottesville Unite the Right rally was reportedly melted in a secretive ceremony in order to ensure the safety of those involved, as though you had all these white supremacists hiding in the bushes. The Washington Post reported that the statue met its end in a 2,250-degree furnace, when it was, quote-unquote, secretly melted down to become a new piece of public art. Now, here's the pretzel logic. So you're saying that this monument to Lee, which was built in 1884, you're saying that it's racist, it's sexist, it's homophobic, it's a symbol of white supremacy. But you're going to use the materials from this statue to build a new public piece of art that's more inclusive. And you wait till this argument comes about where this statue they want to build is not inclusive enough. Well, you left out this group, you left out that group. You're going to offend this group, you're going to offend that group. Guaranteed that's coming down the pike. I mean, when you want to build your own monument out of your own materials that aren't racist, that don't have any racist, homophobic, or sexist connotations. But I'll tell you why they won't do that. They won't do that because they don't have the cash to cough up to do it. That's why, let me take a sip of my coffee here, as I'm trying to wake up here, so getting the cobwebs out of my throat. And footage of Lee's likeness being melted went viral across social media. Now, those of you who want to melt down statues and have these secretive ceremonies, who are popping open bottles of champagne and giving each other a high five, you're sick. You are mentally ill. You need help. You need to take medication, get counseling. I don't care what it is. But you are mentally ill. You're just as bad as the people who see Jesus on the side or claim to see Jesus on the side of an oil tanker in a puddle or on a pancake, and they all gather around and they bow down to the oil tanker, to the puddle or the pancake. You're just as bad as those people. Get some help. So it continues here. The Washington Post reported that, quote, Swords into Plowshares, a project led by University of Virginia religious studies professor Jalane Schmidt, I think that's how you say it, Jalane. And they always have these weird first, you ever notice that they have these weird first names or last names? All these people involved in this, or these projects to remove these statues. And Charlottesville's Black History Museum executive director, Andrea Douglas, quote, will turn bronze ingots made from molten Lee into a new piece of public artwork to be displayed in Charlottesville. They made arrangements for Lee to be melted down while they started collecting ideas from city residents for that new sculpture. Well, I don't know if Ms. or Mrs. Douglas knows this or not, I know this person's married or not. But Africa was a major player in the slave trade, as was the Arab world. Ever hear of the trans-Saharan slave trade? And slavery was built into African society, the African hierarchy. This is well documented. You had African tribal leaders selling their own people into slavery. This whole idea that the white man just went into Africa back in the day and swiped up all these slaves is total BS. That's not what happened. You wouldn't dare back in the day go into Africa because of the terrain. It was dangerous, and you had malaria. The Post went on to say that due to, quote, past threats and worries about legal action, the project went to great lengths to keep itself secret until now. The article made note that Schmidt, quote, who directs the Memory Project at University of Virginia's Karsh Institute of Democracy, well, really isn't democratic, is it? If you're taking down all these statues, melting them down, and having these secretive ceremonies, giving each other high fives, popping open bottles of champagne. How democratic is that? You didn't let me vote on this. Now, this is where the illness comes in, the mental illness. She felt like she was preparing for an execution of sorts, as though this was the French Revolution. Which, by the way, is what they did during the French Revolution. They got rid of all of these symbols representing the aristocracy. I quoted her comparing the destruction of the monument to putting down a rabid dog that had been harming people. See, Robert E. Lee, he's a rabid dog. Now, I want to get into this for a moment. Mentioned here at the beginning of the video that between 1865 and 1915, you had what you would call this quote-unquote sculpture race. You see, in Europe, in the United States, you have this wave of nationalism. Well, nationalism in Europe, not necessarily the United States. But in Europe, you had this wave of nationalism. And they were creating all these monuments. The Eiffel Tower went up in 1887. The Robert E. Lee statue, by the way, went up in 1884, the same year that Bruckner premiered his Seventh Symphony. It was the age of the steamship, these ocean liners. And you had this wave of immigrants that was coming into the United States. And whether you were in the North or South, you were trying to build these monuments, these sculptures, to compete with what was going on in Europe. All the great artists of the time, the Impressionists. But you had these ethnic groups that came into the United States that wanted to get in on the game. So they would start building their own sculptures to people in their own culture. Put that up in their community. That's what was going on back then. So the title of the article, if you're interested, at themet.com, title of the article is From Model to Monument, American Sculpture, 1865 to 1915. But that's what was going on back in the day. So could it be that maybe the reason they were putting these monuments up, if they were putting up in the North and the South, was to compete with what was going on in Europe? Yeah, absolutely. Quote, still, that dark feeling was better than carting Charlottesville's white supremacist toxic waste. You see, this statue to Robert E. Lee, it's toxic waste. Why don't you say that about the American flag, the Union flag? Because Native American tribes were treated the best under the Union flag. And you did have the Cherokee and the Seminole that fought with the Confederates during the Civil War. How many know that we should take down the flag in California? Because in 1862, Leland Stanford, so no mention of Leland Stanford, Stanford University. Because Leland Stanford, during his inaugural address, if you will, 1862, governor of California, he called the Asians an inferior race. He did. He called the Asians an inferior race. 1862. Isn't that the start of the Civil War, or right in the middle of the Civil War? But somehow the South is racist. All these sculptures are racist. By the way, one of the biggest investors in Southern plantations in slavery was the Bank of New York. Go look it up if you don't believe me. Bank of New York. Quote, it's a better sculpture right now than it's ever been, one of the metal casters said. We're taking away what it meant for some people and transforming it. Now, this is where it gets good. So, United Methodist minister, Reverend Isaac Collins, delivered a sermon at the ceremony. So, this is a religious ceremony to these people. Of the statue being destroyed, and has previously declared that it is a sin to have monuments celebrating figures from the Confederacy. Well, you know what? He should get rid of his Bible, because slavery is mentioned all throughout the Bible, and I grew up in a Judeo-Christian home. Slavery is everywhere in the Bible. No man can serve two masters. The Jews were, or the Israelites were, slaves in Egypt. The Washington Post did not name the owner of the foundry, but suggested, quote, to him melting the statue down meant the trauma will be gone when black people pass squares where Confederate statues once stood. The trauma. Did this statue wink at you, make a pass at you, call you a racist name? Probably not. And how many people who are black or what have you have passed by these monuments time and time again back in the day? And they said, you know, that is a racist statue because that statue winked at me. It called me a racist name, made a pass at me. NPR also covered the event and credited Swords into Plowshares for its efforts to, quote, create a more inclusive public art installation. And again, this argument's going to come about, I guarantee it, that it's not going to be inclusive enough. Well, you left out this group, you left out that group. Guaranteed that's what's going to happen. So I'll leave you with this quote. Quote, we want to transform something that has been toxic in the Charlottesville community, Schmidt said. We want to transform it into a piece of art that the community can be proud of and gather around and not feel excluded or intimidated. Well, how about using your own materials to build your own statue that has no connotations to racism or a connection to racism, sexism, or homophobia? But you're going to melt down the statue, which you're claiming is a racist statue. You're going to use materials from this statue to create a new statue to be more inclusive. Yeah, that makes total sense. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, once again, an article at Fox News. They've melted down the Robert E. Lee statue to get rid of racism, sexism, and homophobia, and yet we still have this war going on in Israel. And we had people last week in D.C. who were saying that that Israel should go into the sea, Palestine should be free. You've ended racism, buddy. You've ended racism. Way to go. Can we give a round of applause to all these SJWs? Thank you. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, you know what to do. You can also follow me at Instagram, #JasonComposes, because I write music in my spare time. Or you can find me at X, Culture Confederacy, at CultureConfed1 on X. This is the Culture Confederacy saying peace out, stay safe, everybody. God bless this thing called the United States. And you know how we do it here. This is where the past crashes with the present. I'll catch you next time, and you all have a great weekend.